Checking it out. Testing. Okay. It's in here already. Welcome. Howdy. Getting things set up here, so bear with me for a moment. And what I'm trying here... Oh, first of all, can you hear me okay? Here in Twitch? I tried it myself just a moment ago, and it seemed like I could hear myself, but... Oh, perfect. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so now I'm going to try advanced moves. I'm going to see if I can set up an Instagram live stream simultaneously. Maybe a really bad idea. All right. Got a phone set up right here. And I've got Twitch set up right here. Theory, possibly a very bad theory. Should be able to manage both of these things simultaneously. So we'll see. So that's the idea. Still getting started. Hey. I'm managing two different things here. I've got Twitch in front of me. I've got Instagram right here. It's going to be a Q&A session. And I've got a collection of questions that I've gathered already from Instagram earlier today. What I'm trying to figure out right now, though, is I just tested my audio here on Twitch. Can you hear me okay over here on Instagram? Does that carry over? Because this mic is not hooked up to that, so that's just all phone. Yo, anybody has a chance to comment there real quick. And let me know if this is even worth trying. Yeah? Okay, good. I got a thumbs up, got some hearts. That feels generally good. Well, if anybody's interested over here on Instagram, you can join me on Twitch. My name on there is Virtual Colin. It'll be a little bit easier to see questions on Twitch because the chat bar is persistent. It sticks around rather than going up really quick. So there's a chance if you ask a question over here on Instagram, I will be able to answer you, but probably only if I'm not in the middle of another answer and I see the question as it comes up. That said, I will do my best to answer the questions that are asked in these chat rooms in real time first, and then I will answer questions that have been pre-submitted as well if I don't see any questions pop up. So do let me know if you have any questions that come to mind immediately, and I'll try to start with that. But actually, while you're thinking about that, here I'll type in my Virtual Colin. There we go. So if you want to join on Twitch, go ahead and do that. The comments are persistent over here. Otherwise, I will try to notice the questions when you ask them there and try to catch them and maybe jot a note myself. They disappear. Otherwise, it looks like I've already got a question here in Twitch, so I'm going to go ahead and get cracking. How do you feel about the increasing commercialization of minimalism? It's a big question. There's a lot of potential directions you can go with that because I think there's the commercialization of what I consider to be very positive aspects of minimalism, but then there's also the commercialization of aspects that are very good for business, but not necessarily aligned with what I consider to be minimalism and the components of that, philosophical aspects of minimalism that I consider to be most vital. To To put that in context, though, I mean, minimalism is this great big thing that means very different things to different people, and that's true in terms of different trades and fields and realms of study. It means a different thing to an architect and a designer and somebody like me who writes about minimalism and the practice of minimalism and using it to figure out what's most vital to you. And for me, minimalism means figuring out what is most important in your life across all facets of your life, and then using that knowledge to ensure that you spend more of your time, energy, and resources, including money, but also other resources, on those most vital things. Now, that is not something that, in most ways, I'm sure you can imagine, is great for making a bunch of money, at least not within the current type of capitalism that we practice today. It's usually better to encourage people to buy stuff rather than to ask themselves deep questions before they buy anything. It makes a whole lot of sense that if you are within a system where you need to consistently sell stuff or you go out of business, and then you can't pay the rent, you can't pay your employees, you can't continue to do that business, that you want to sell more, not less. So it's not a message that carries very well across a whole lot of the vehicles that we have, the mediums that we have to share that kind of message. Now, you can do it. You can do it well. I mean, I write and speak about these things. There's some other people who have done a very good job at building out their brands and building essentially media and otherwise empires around this concept. And they've managed to keep it a concept that is relatively pure in the sense that they're talking about the concept and making money incidentally, as opposed to trying to sell you minimalism t-shirt or something like that, or the exact right vase or a piece of art that has to be exactly the right way, or you're not a minimalist. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the entities that are picking up on this trend and spreading it most enthusiastically are people who maybe fall into a different category. They are people who are selling the minimalist t-shirt, or they're selling you something that is associated with the demographics, or maybe themes that demographics that they want to sell to find to be anything like the concept of minimalism. So they'll take chunks of it, they'll take these pieces and then productize it or turn it into some kind of service, and then that becomes the thing that you're buying into, as opposed to it just being a free philosophy, something that you can think about and use to then shape your practices and the way that you do operate your life. So I have very mixed feelings about it, because on one hand, we're living in a world where communicating, I mean, obviously I'm doing 2 different live streams, 2 different services that are free for me to use, and hopefully, I think, at least for you to use as well. That's cool that we can communicate in so many different ways and share these messages with each other via so many different mechanisms. But it's also tricky because that commercialization of this concept and many other concepts, it unfortunately focuses on very specific aspects of some of these ideas, and as a consequence can make them very superficial versions of the more complete thing that we might want to actually have transmitted far and wide. Hopefully that makes sense. I think there's a minimalist aesthetic too, which I do want to differentiate, just like I had mentioned about design and architecture. Within products, minimalist can mean a very different thing. So if you buy minimalist sculpture, that's not going to be the same thing. And I don't necessarily think that you're going against the philosophy of minimalism to make a minimalist sculpture and sell that, because that's minimalist in the sense that you're stripping down the attributes of the sculpture itself, as opposed to thinking about products more holistically, in which case that might be something that minimalism philosophy would apply to. Thanks for the question. Great question. I've seen a couple of questions flip through here and scroll. First one that I'm seeing here is, what's your next destination? So I'm currently hunkered down in beautiful, scenic Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the United States, which is an absolutely beautiful place, and it's lovely. And it's freezing outside most of the time right now, which is my jam. This is definitely my cup of tea, so I'm enjoying it. Unironically enjoying the cold. I'm very keen to travel, though, and I've been hesitant to do so because I'm somebody who we're all in very different circumstances, and we're in the middle of a global pandemic, so we all do what we can within that context. Do our own math, take our own risk assessments. We're using different formulas, in some cases, unfortunately, different data sets as well. But for me, I don't have to travel. I like to travel, and I'm looking forward to getting back on the road, but I can also do what I need to do professionally, and most of what I need, the core of what I need socially, from anywhere. And so I can do that here. My goal, my ambition maybe, is to do a road trip around the US and Canada. And that's what I was planning to do before the whole pandemic thing swirled into the razor tornado that it turned into, where it's just horrible for so many different reasons and seems to be just going on and on and on. So as soon as we're in a position where the math that I'm doing in terms of my risk assessment and not wanting to become a plague spreader, as soon as that tones down, getting more favorable figures from that math, then I'm planning on driving around US and Canada for a bit. Maybe I'll do some talks or other get-togethers if that's safe. Otherwise, I'll just visit friends and family. I have a new niece and a new nephew that I'm very keen to see in real life as soon as it's safe to do so. But I've also just got a whole lot of friends that I haven't seen in ages. And I love driving around to random places, or traveling around. Driving is fun, but traveling in general, whether it's by train, plane, or boat, or whatever. Traveling to random places that you wouldn't necessarily think to go. And the US is incredible for this because we have so many weird spaces in between the places that you would think to go. And for me, the best aspects of the United States, the highway system that connects everything, you can just turn off of it on any of these random off-ramps, and you'll find something weird and interesting. And I like to randomize the process to a certain degree, in some cases just pointing randomly at a map, driving for a set amount each day, and then pulling off and finding a place and finding a hotel or an Airbnb, and just figuring out what there is to see. So my grand ambition and my next destination is probably still here in North America. There's a couple of opportunities that I've had on the back burner elsewhere around the world that I'll probably, I mean, as soon as I'm able, take advantage of those as well. But in the near future, I am very much looking forward to that simple, the relatively simple ambition of just driving around and going else and not worrying that I will be hurt or hurt somebody else. Let's see here. Thanks. Message from a podcaster in India. Cool. Yeah, reach out to me. If you want to talk to me for your podcast, reach out to me at colin@exilelifestyle.com, and I'd be happy to come to San Diego. I like San Diego. Yeah, hopefully when I'm out there visiting the coast, I can by San Diego. You can come to Chile. You know, I want to, and actually my parents are now both retired as of last year, or early this year, I think late last year. And so they're wanting to do more travel. And they reached out to me recently and said, hey, have you ever been to Santiago? And I have, and I really enjoyed it. And they said, yeah, maybe we can all, like as a family, or part of the family can go down to Santiago. So you may be seeing me and my retired parents in Chile sooner than you think. Oh, here's one, another minimalist question. What do you do every day as a minimalist practice? So minimalism, I mean, at least the way that I define it and look at it, it's not something like a specific brand or modality of meditation where there's certain chants or breathing work. Typically, what it is for some people, especially if you're just getting started and trying to figure out who am I even and what do I even want and what's important to me, there's a whole lot of clearing away clutter, sometimes literal clutter and sometimes psychological clutter or emotional clutter. And that can be a process. And that might be actually setting aside time each day to go through, clean out a closet, clean out a room, clean out a drawer, work through things that you haven't worked through, taking the time to expose yourself to new things so you can figure out what you actually care about and want to focus on. After a certain point, though, it's not necessarily something where you're going to have time each day set aside to do minimalism. Like, it's not that kind of thing, or at least not for me. So generally, most of what I do in a day, just because of how I've focused and the things I've chosen to focus on, I am expending most of my time and energy and resources on those most important things. And it's taken me over a decade to get here, but I'm at the point where almost always most of what's in my life fits that criteria. And so my minimalist practice is really just enjoying those carved out things that I've managed to set aside for myself. And that time that I've managed to reclaim for myself, time, energy, and resources that I've managed to reclaim for myself from all those other things that I previously occupying all of those. So at a certain point, and I think honestly it's something that you should probably do from the beginning, because that's what it's ultimately. It's enjoying those things that you're reclaiming for yourself from these drains on your time that you might otherwise have passively, that have accumulated over. Please do feel free on Twitch or on Instagram, ask any questions you might have. I'm working through a backlog here. Instagram. Sorry if I haven't gotten to your question yet. And then I also have some questions that people have asked ahead of time on Instagram, so I'll get to those. My life, converted a van, and have been traveling the world for the last year. That is wonderful. Congratulations. That's so cool. I bought an old 1985 RV, a motorhome. Fixed that up and traveled full-timed in that for a bit while on tour around North America. And man, I mean, there's a lot of stresses. It's a very different sort of lifestyle. I haven't done the van thing, and I feel like that would be, in some ways, there are some aspects of that lifestyle that are a little bit tedious, especially if you have to go on stage on a regular basis, because sometimes finding showers can be difficult. But there's so many aspects of that lifestyle that I think would have been better if I would have had a smaller, rather than the 33-foot motorhome that I had. If I would have had a smaller vehicle, it would have been a lot more enjoyable. I think you're doing the right way. Congratulations. Japan, lovely. Tell Japan I say hi. That's actually on my list of places to go because I've stopped through Japan, but I've never had the chance to actually explore it. And I desperately want to. It was actually one of my intentions a couple of years ago. I ended up doing something else because the stars aligned on a few opportunities, but I almost went to Japan and then spent several months there just traveling around by train. And that is still on my list, so hopefully, once all the diseases plaguing us die down, I'll have the opportunity to go do that. Here, finding some questions. Please do feel free to ask any questions. Have them. And thanks for showing up too. Actually, in Twitch and in Instagram too, if you don't mind and if you're feeling it, real quickly share where you are watching from. And if you want to, your age as well. That's just data that I'm curious about. But I like being able to see and then showing other people too that we're connecting with an international audience here. We're all connecting with people around the world. And I find that's a really nice message to take away from these, that we have more in common than we have differences. And that's true with our interests and the things that we happen to stream on the internet. Still playing. Oh, my Twitch username, if anybody didn't see it on here and you want to join, is Virtual Colin. And I'm actually planning. So I've been experimenting with it. I've finally learned just enough to be dangerous and get the basics in place. And I've got 20 some odd followers. Watch out, Kardashians. I'm coming for you. Nipping at your heels with my 27 followers. But I'm building it up, and I'm intending next week to actually do, I think, now that I know I can stream at this time of night, even when all of my neighbors are streaming Netflix and such, and using some of the internet availability, knowing that I can do this, I think next week, every weekday, I'm going to do a sort of spin-off live stream of one of my projects, One Sentence News. And I guess to a certain degree, Let's Know Things, my podcast as well. And just taking 3 news items that I talked about in that day's issue of One Sentence News, I send out every weekday, each morning, and then extrapolating a little bit on it, giving some additional context about these things that are happening in the news. And the idea of that project is to try to give people a situational awareness of what's happening in the world around them without feeling the need to stress out and without being deluged with constant breaking news and everything is important and horse race journalism and a lot of the unfortunate things that unfortunately have been the natural consequence of the incentives in place in journalism. Some of the best journalism happening ever in history is happening right now, but it's buried, unfortunately. And unless you're like me and you spend all day, or a good portion of the day, working through the news and trying to figure out what's happening, then you don't necessarily know. So this project is an extension of that existing project to try to share some of that information with people, which I think is important and valuable for us to have a broader context and understanding of what's happening in the world without it being something that leads to a bunch of stress and anxiety and a sense that we can't do anything about anything. If you are on Twitch, or if you're thinking of joining Twitch or wouldn't mind joining Twitch and something like that sounds interesting, Virtual Colin is where I'll be doing that. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. You know, so somebody said that they like my voice on here. I actually have a podcast that was, pardon me, talking about my voice, and then everything goes sideways. I have a podcast called I Will Read to You, and it's just me reading public domain work, primarily poetry, but also essays and books and things like that when I find good ones. And the idea was basically to learn to use not this microphone, but I have a fancy microphone I use when I'm podcasting. And the idea was to basically have an excuse to experiment with that and get better with it. And also work out, I had some medical issues last year and the year before, and a little bit still, but and part of it involved my jaw and a little bit of surgery that I had to have. So it was working out the muscles in my jaw too to make sure that I could continue to do what I do for a living. And so I started a podcast called I Will Read to You. If you just want to hear me reading things, especially poetry, you might consider subscribing. Oh, thank you. So appreciating Let's Know Things. How do you parse through the information in a world that is so dense with bias and overload? Great question. Very related to what I was just talking about, too. So I started Let's Know Things, actually, 2016. And it was a moment that, for a lot of reasons, was very difficult for the press. And part of that difficulty, actually, was that news consumption was just going sky high. This was an election year. Donald Trump had become president. There was a whole lot of stuff happening politically and internationally, and people were learning a great deal about a great deal and suddenly caring about journalism in a way that they hadn't before. And that led to a lot of good work, but also a lot of toxic incentives that encouraged a certain type of reporting that was not necessarily about conveying the best information in the best way, but instead about getting the most of this new enthusiastic audience to join our service, subscribe to our thing, pay our subscription. And I very much do think that we should be supporting our journalism, especially local journalism, but journalism in general doesn't have the resources that it probably should have in a political system in which we rely on it to be an outside source of information. That's what it's supposed to be anyway. But Let's Know Thing was founded on the premise that a lot of these entities in the journalism world are not able to do deep dives, and they're not able to give expanded context on things in the way that I thought was important. Giving historical context, giving context across industries and types of news. If you're talking about a political story, very often that connects to the economy. It attaches to technology. There's a whole lot of relevance 200 years ago and things that happened back then. And if you can't take the time because of your format is you have a couple of inches in a newspaper, or you have 500 words that somebody had to knock out really quickly to post on a website because they have to post 7 other stories that day or they're fired. That's not something that allows you to necessarily talk about these different topics in a cohesive and contextually aware way. So the podcast was an experiment, really, because I didn't know what I was doing with podcasts. I'd never had one before. I'd never really used a microphone before except to record a couple of my own audiobooks. So I thought it might be a good experiment for that, to learn to use these technologies, but also just to see if it was something that I could make and if it would be valuable to anybody. And fortunately, I've learned a great deal more about producing it. I dusted off a whole lot of my old news analysis skills. It's part of why I care so much about journalism, is that I have a good deal of history in journalism. And in particular, looking at the good reporting and the good data generated by other journalists, and then taking that and then trying to put it in a form that makes sense to other people who don't have any reason to know or care what that stuff is or what it means. That's kind of my focus. And so the idea was to take that focus, which I had previously used writing newspaper columns, and to try to apply it in the podcasting world. So that was the impetus for creating it. Parsing that information is actually, it's funny because it's the secret sauce of the entire endeavor. It's something that looks very, very easy because all I can say is I take what's happening in the news and then I do a bunch of research and then I spit it back out, hopefully in an intelligible way that makes sense to people and gets people to care enough that maybe they do more research, or maybe they pay a little more attention to what's happening, or if nothing else, they're just a little bit more aware of something that's happening in the world today. And they feel less intimidated by that information in such a way that they might go pay attention more and get more information in the well. But there's a lot that goes into that. And actually, the only reason I'm really able to do that, to do Let's Know Things and one sentence news as well, because that's kind of the opposite problem. Let's Know Things, I'm trying to stretch things out and give more depth and breadth, whereas one sentence news is taking a complex topic, or a series of 3 of them every single day, and reducing them down to a 1-sentence summary and a 1-sentence explanation of context, which I initially started to challenge myself. It sounded very difficult. It's almost always more difficult than to expand. But I kept doing it because it was such a good challenge for me, because it really forced me to look at information differently. So, I mean, the very short answer after that very long answer is that I sit with a lot of this information. I read a lot about a lot, and that's the case with the news, but I also read 2 or 3 books a week, just on a variety of different topics. And then I just shove all that information together in ways that make sense to me. And making connections between things it's, by some estimations, one of the better ways to remember anything, but it's just the way that my brain works. Finding interconnections between things is how I take a new bit of information and connect it to all of the existing stuff and then allow myself to recall it later. So the parsing is in large part making those connections and then figuring out how to pluck data as efficiently as possible without losing that context and without losing the opportunity to research further for myself, and then over time spitting that out, hopefully in ways that make sense to people, that is not boring or annoying or stressful, and ideally in ways that get people as excited about some of this stuff as I am. Good question. Thanks very much for listening, too. I appreciate that. There's a one-sentence news podcast, too. Hey, welcome to the folks who have joined on Twitch. Anybody who's joined recently on Instagram, too. See here. I'm working through some of the questions here on Instagram, but if you have a question on Twitch or Instagram, please feel free to ask. I'm working through those, and I've got some backup questions that were asked earlier if I need them. Buenos Aires. Cool. I lived there for a bit. That was my first home outside the US. Welcome. Athens, Ohio. Sweden. Yeah, it's super late there. Joining. I think. Oh my god, there's a way to ask questions on Instagram that like sets the questions aside. Oh, this is a blast. Okay, I'm gonna get to those. There. Any advice for getting started with podcasting, particularly around building an audience? Yes. So with anything that you're learning, where I think this is true with knowledge as well, at least in books and things that you might take, but especially with anything that requires equipment and gear, be very, very careful not to get too excited about the gear and to not fixate on the gear. Do not come to believe the way that a lot of resources would have you believe, for a variety of reasons, that simply buying an expensive microphone will lead to a great podcast. It certainly doesn't hurt, but it's kind of like high-end like chef equipment, where if you don't know how to cook, a really nice chef knife and the fanciest pots and pans will not do you any good. Much, much better is to buy the bare basics, or even more ideally, use what you've already got, and do that until you've learned so much that that gear is no longer good enough for where you are in terms of skill and knowledge, and then just progressively increase. I mean, if you're independently wealthy, go ahead, buy whatever you want. If you're like me and you are not, unfortunately, independently wealthy, you have to be a little bit more careful and thoughtful about it. So I would say when you're starting out, use what you have already if you can. Invest in relatively inexpensive gear that's just a step above being a toy, because you don't want something that is going to ruin your effort and make you think that you're not good at it or that you're doing something wrong. Ideally, you do something that is good enough to be neutral, but not so grand that it's influencing you in such a way that you don't feel compelled to learn more. So buy something cheap. You can get a halfway decent mic for 20, 30 bucks these days. This is one that I bought. So I actually started with a $200-ish microphone, a Rode Podcaster back in the day. And I ended up replacing it when I was traveling because it's huge. And it looks a bit like a sex toy, like, not gonna lie. So when you're traveling through the TSA checkpoint, you get a lot of strange looks, and they always pull it out, I think, just to get a look and laugh at you, maybe. So that one's not great to travel with. This one's much easier to travel with. It cost 50 bucks, and it sounds almost exactly the same. If I had to rate the quality, I'd say it's like 95%. So when you can find something like that, where if you're getting 95 or 90% of the quality and it costs a fourth as much, this is the time to go for that, because you may not stick with it. That's the thing. You don't want to invest in a whole lot of gear and then find yourself sitting on this dragon's hoard of amazing stuff that you're never going to use. And again, you also don't want it influencing your perception of your work to the point where you don't put in the effort and get better because your stuff is so good and is holding you up, essentially. In terms of actually making the podcast, make sure you know what you want to talk about. Make sure you understand what it is that you're offering that nobody else is. It's okay if you're doing something inspired by somebody else, but try to find something that's uniquely you. If you're just making it to make it, that's fine. Make absolutely anything you want. You can just scream into a microphone and publish it if that's something that brings you joy. But if you want something that people are going to want to listen to, they need to be convinced why they should listen to you, somebody they don't know, a podcast they haven't heard of, rather than the person doing something very similar who is probably more established if you're copying them. So make sure that you've got some kind of niche, something unique, something that you bring to the table. It's a good idea as well to remember that you're going to be making a lot of these. So if you have 1 or 2 really good episodes in mind, that's great. But if you intend to consistently do this and to continue doing it over time, you might want to make sure that your concept can be extended out. Part of the reason that I liked the Let's Know Things concept so much is that it was something that I knew I could do forever, because there's always more news and there's always more to learn and explore. And so I didn't see myself running out of subject matter and things to talk about anytime soon. So that's worth keeping in mind too. I know several people who have started podcasts and just found that they didn't have enough, and it unintentionally then became a limited run of 2 or 3 episodes, and then they quit. In terms of garnering audience, I wish I had a really good silver bullet answer for you on this. And this is the case with writing and books and YouTube and anything else you might do. There are a lot of growth hacks out there. And these are things that if you have a bunch of money to throw at the problem, conceivably, some of them you actually could make work, conceivably. Just buying a whole bunch of advertisements and sponsorship, things like that. I mean, it gets you something. It won't get you much if you don't have the content, if it's not good stuff that people will stick around for. But I mean, if you do have something that's baseline decent, then spending a bunch of money on it, throwing money at the problem, will work, as it often does within a society like ours. Otherwise, I mean, it's kind of like the creation of the podcast itself, in that it's kind of a grind. And maybe I am a bit biased on this, where I tend to prioritize the organic side of things. So rather than trying to do anything gimmicky or tricky, or, here's the template and this will get you X, Y, and Z, here's the stuff that you'll get 100 new followers a day if you do this, this, and this. It's not my thing. I tend to just stick around. and if you stick around long enough, you tend to accumulate. You build up a small audience. You tend to accumulate backlinks, people linking to you, sharing your stuff. You want to make sure that your stuff is visible and accessible to as many people as possible. Otherwise, they can't link to you and share stuff. You want to share your stuff when possible. Take opportunities that arise naturally, and do it in a non-douchey way. Like, you don't want to be that guy who's just constantly pushing their stuff on everybody else that they know, because then it's annoying rather than something that's interesting and that people want to check out. But then sticking around tends to help, and it's something that allows you to grow. And then one day you wake up and realize, oh, one, my podcast is much better, but also I've got a few hundred people listening to it. And a magical thing happens when you've got some base audience, when there's a certain number of people who consider what you're doing or what you're saying or what you're making good enough to stick around. That tends to pay dividends. That's something that grows over time. There's a concept called the Matthew effect, actually, that is relevant here. It's basically it's a benefit that is derived from accumulated advantage. And this is a law that says the famous tend to get more famous, the rich tend to get more rich. And the famous get more famous because they're already famous. If you are famous, you will get on magazine covers. You will get check marks next to your name. You will get shared on social networks so they can brag about you being on their network. All of these things accumulate because you're already famous. If you're rich, you have more money to invest in things that allow you to get more rich. These are advantages that are latent to having a certain amount of something already. And it's arguably not fair, but it is just something that happens. And what you're able to do if you stick around long enough, and if you work on your craft enough, and if you take those opportunities when they arise, and it doesn't hurt to be a decent person and just treat people well as well, so you don't build up a bad reputation and just salt the ground behind yourself. But if you do that long enough, you tend to build up a little bit of that accumulated advantage, and that's something that helps. I can tell you, after doing what I do since, 2009, and elements of it before that, but that's when I really got started, working for myself and making the stuff that I make today. there's a certain amount of accumulated advantage that happens no matter what. And it's not huge, but there's more people who are willing to give you the benefit of the doubt when you try something else out. And that's something that you have that somebody who's just starting and hasn't been doing things as long don't have. And again, it's not fair, but it is something to be aware of, and it's something to recognize that there's value just in persistence and durability and stamina. Just being able to hold out and grit your teeth and keep going. Even through those early initial stages where you're on Twitch and you have 27 followers, you can stick around long enough, potentially, hit 30. You dream. And it doesn't hurt to take a look at some of those other tricks and tactics and strategies. A lot of them, though, are not going to get you what you want. And a lot of them will lead to potentially metrics of success where people are maybe showing up and clicking on things. It's like the Reddit effect, if you've heard of that, where a million people will show up at your website after nobody visiting forever because somebody found it and linked to it. And then, they crash your website because it got so much traffic, and then nobody shows up ever again. That's not what you want. Ideally, at least from my perspective and for my values on this sort of thing, you build something that people care about and something that people want to see do well over. And so if that's what you're looking for, that's what I would recommend. Just making sure that you're doing the best work you can, investing appropriately, investing in yourself appropriately, but also the fear that you have, and doing your best to be like a good citizen in the spaces that you operate, and then taking advantage of good knowledge and strategy when you find it, but not succumbing to the desire for the quick fix, because the quick fix almost always won't be what you want it to be. That's like somebody saying, I've got a strategy and you will win the lottery every time. Yeah? Really? Why don't you have 1 million followers on YouTube, guy who's telling me I can get followers on YouTube? Huh? Almost always these are ways to sell books, or don't succumb to that temptation. Good question. So I've got some other, but let me grab this one on Twitch here. What happened to your early projects and books? Why can't we buy them now? So I recently, maybe a year ago, started going through some of my older work. And I realized that some of it just isn't reflective of who I am or what I believe anymore. And while there's still some valuable stuff in some of these books, it wasn't something that I necessarily wanted out there being representative of what I think or who I am. And none of it in the like canceling sort of way. It wasn't anything horrible. It was just like different. I would put things different ways. Or in the cases of narrative nonfiction, where I was telling stories, I no longer feel it's really appropriate to share people's actual names and stuff, even if they give you permission, which everybody always did for my books. It makes me a little uncomfortable, and that's that discomfort for myself, but also for other people, led to some takedowns of some of my books where I wasn't comfortable, so I them from sale. That said, I know just from emails I received that some people still find some value in some of those older works. So if there's something out there that you know of that you would like to have and it's no longer available for sale, just send me an email and I'll send you an ebook or an audiobook if it's available. I'll make sure that you have access to it. This is just me trying to make sure that things that I wrote over a decade ago are not shaping people's perception of what I'm writing and creating today. That makes sense. So how to find the courage to pursue your dream and not care about money? That's a good question. So living today in a society shaped in large part, well, maybe not entirely, almost entirely, by scarcity, what economics is, science and study and practice of scarcity. Living as we do in a society where money is necessary, and in some societies, you will literally be allowed to die if you don't have enough of it. You kind of have to have money, and you kind of have to care about it, at least to a certain degree. My beginning as a creator of things, doing what I do today, where I write and I make stuff, and then I've largely managed to free up a whole lot of my time that I was previously expending on other things. That began when I made a hard pivot from a lifestyle in which I was very focused on the accumulation of money. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. We all have very different needs. We all have very different priorities, different things that fulfill us. For me, at that point in my life, I kind of liked the game of it. I liked the idea that if I worked harder than everybody else, and if I was clever about certain things, if I made certain decisions and investments, that I might be able to win in some ways according to the score of money. It wasn't something where I was trying to earn money for anything in particular. I just thought this is what you do. That was just the way that it was always pitched to me. Through school, through life, this is just what you do. Something that you pursue, and this designates the value of people to a certain degree. And as soon as I questioned that, as soon as I allowed myself to recognize that was how I was seeing life, right after I turned 24, I realized, oh my God, that's not me at all. I mean, I have all these other things I care about. And like in the back of my head, I was telling myself at some point, you'll win the game and you'll earn X amount of dollars, and then you'll quit and you'll just retire young. And then you'll go off and travel and see things, and you'll live according to all these other standards that you've always kind of held dear, but you've held dear in a way that you wouldn't allow yourself to directly look at them, because that would mean you'd actually have to pursue them. You'd have to do something to move closer to them. And as soon as I allowed myself to acknowledge that, I realized, oh man, now I actually have to do something about these things that I've been able to just keep conveniently out of the way while I pursued the money stuff all this time for the past 24 years. So it's not caring about money. It's having an appropriate sense of what money is and what money does for you and what role money plays in your life. There's a certain amount of money I know I need to make in order to live my life. It's a different amount here, living in Milwaukee, than it was living in Argentina, than it was living in New Zealand, than it was living in Iceland. It's different in different circumstances because all the variables change. But in each place that I go, in each set of variables, I have an understanding of what I need to make in order to sustain a basic level of sustenance, but also to live well. And live well not in the sense of racing yachts, but live well in the sense of not worrying about money all day, every day, not being stressed out, not being forced to go into debt, and not being in a situation where if something happens, I don't have what I need to get out of that situation. To a certain degree, too, I mean, it varies depending on what I'm up to. Having enough money to be able to afford to buy a microphone if I want to start a podcast, things like that. These are priorities that are not crazy expensive, but it's still an amount of money I know I need to make. And so I have to work that into all of my plans. And I need to figure out ways to earn that much money on whatever cadence I'm working with, monthly, yearly, whatever. But thinking of it in those terms and thinking of that money as like the ground I'm standing on then allows me to not have to think about it very much at all with everything else that I'm doing. As long as I can figure out and periodically check in to make sure I'm still able to consistently make that money, then I'm in a good spot to not have to worry about it and to pursue the stuff that I actually care about. The money thing, the high score of the money is not something that actually happy. That sort of social comparison, just have no interest in it these days. But the other things that having that stable foundation allows me to do, and not having to sit around and worry that I'm not going to be able to pay my rent, or that I'm going to find myself with some passion that I want to cultivate, but I can't afford the microphone I need, or the chef's knife that I need, or whatever it is that I need to get started. Not having those things allows me to throw myself more into these dreams, passions. But it is something that still requires some. So it's sad. I wish I could just say, and maybe someday we'll be in a post-scarcity society, whatever that looks like, technological, maybe in space. I don't know. Maybe someday we'll be in a situation where we don't have to worry about that at all, because the scarcity element won't be there, and thus we won't need money to help keep track of the scarcity. At the moment, it is a good idea, if you want to pursue whatever your dreams happen to be and invest in yourself in that way, and build a lifestyle that's more custom tailored for you, it's a good idea to get a fundamental understanding and education, not necessarily a formal one. Everything I learned about this stuff I learned from books and YouTube, reading blogs and things like that. But if you can get a fundamental education of economics, of money, of things like that, you're in a much better place to then take your time, energy, and resources and spend it appropriately without having the money thing weighing on you as you try to do that. It's a disappointing answer. I do wish I could just say you don't have to worry about it. Just quit your job and run into the woods, but I can't tell you that. That's irresponsible. Let's see here. Oh, that's a really good question. There's some other good ones too, and I will get to those momentarily, but just had I Bike Mountains ask in Twitch, joining from Olympia, Washington, lovely area. A question. I noticed that at some point you started calling yourself an analytic journalist. I recall at the beginning of Let's Know Things, you said that you were not a journalist. Can you talk about the process of embracing this title? Yes. So, titles are weird. And I don't like titles, I don't like labels. There's a lot I could conceivably apply to myself, but I find in a lot of cases, they lead to a lot of tribalism, in the sense that we need to adhere to certain standards that are not necessarily our own. In a very literal sense, I'm an analytic journalist. I do news analysis, and that means I take information from the world, I take reporting, I take data, I take other facts to the best of my ability to assess what is fact and what's not, and I try to rearrange those in ways. And there's different types of analytic journalists. Some of them are more specifically called data journalists, where they take raw numbers on spreadsheets and turn them into beautiful graphs, motion graphics, or that. It's a really cool field. But then there's other people like me that are more kind of vanilla analytic journalists who soak up all this stuff and then try to spit it out in whatever format makes sense, either for the purpose or for our skill set. And for me, a lot of that is writing. I had trouble with this at first, though, in large part because while I initially did a lot of journalistic education, formal education, at some point I pivoted away and I continued to work professionally as an analytic journalist for newspapers, but I didn't get my degree in journalism. And I feel a lot of respect for the journalists who are doing the actual reporting. And I consider analytic journalism and journalism to be distinct things. They're in the same field, but they're very different practices. And what they do, what folks are doing when they're going out and reporting and collecting this actual data and finding actual stuff that's going on the ground, and in a lot of cases risking their lives to do it, that is something I just have an immense amount of respect for, and I couldn't do my job without them doing their job well. So I, for a very long time, and still to a certain degree do, carve out a distinction between the two. Because what I do is more heavily focused on interpretation and communication, whereas what they do is actual reporting. And that, by a lot of definitions, including generally my definition, that is raw, fundamental journalism. So that's why I go back and forth on this, but the negotiation that I had internally with it was that I could use the title analytic journalist to explain to people that I have some background on this and I actually do know what I'm doing with this professionally. I've been doing it since high school professionally, actually. But it is a distinct thing. And journalists who are actually putting themselves on the line to collect that data, without which I would not be able to do my job, they should bear that hallowed title of journalism. They should be allowed to do that potentially, as opposed to those of us who need some kind of addendum on the title. Hopefully that makes sense. That's a very in the weeds sort of answer, but it's something that I think a lot about because I don't want to imply that they're the same, even though I think both are valuable for different reasons. Great question, thank you. I had. Do you still think that non-monogamy is the way to go? Context for this. So I've been in relationships that are both monogamous and ethically non-monogamous of different flavors. And I wouldn't actually be prescriptive. I don't think any of them are superior to any of the others. I think it's entirely dependent on the relationship and the people in it. So I think for some people, more strict or traditional monogamy makes a whole lot of sense. I think for other people, some kind of ethical non-monogamy like polyamory, open relationships, something, swinging, whatever you want. I mean, any of this stuff makes sense for the right people. But the really important thing is that you ask yourself, you and your partner, or partners conceivably, you make sure that everybody is having their needs fulfilled. Needs are met, nobody's being taken advantage of, nobody's being coerced, everybody's on the same page. Then you can't really do it wrong as long as you make sure that there's continuous communication, you're checking in, make sure that everybody continues to get what they need out of the relationship. So I would say for some people, I think it probably is a good option. For most of us, it probably won't be just one thing or the other. It won't be monogamy in this very specific way that it's always been practiced for thousands of years in this particular part of the world, and it won't be this very specific type polyamory or open relationships. It'll probably be a blend of things. It'll be something custom fitted. And ideally, I personally think that's what we should do, is we should grab ingredients from everybody's different ideas, everybody's cookbooks, see what works, see what seems interesting, and then make sure, again, in the context of making sure that everybody's taken care of and not being hurt, and that you can adjust things as time goes by to make sure that continues to be the case. Try things out, put together your own recipe. I think ideally we're happy and healthy and growing, and these relationships allow 1 + 1 to equal 3, as opposed to us being incomplete without somebody else. So if you can create a relationship, whatever the dynamic or rules, lack of rules happen to be within that relationship, I think you're doing it right. Oh, here's a good one. This is advice on how to embrace being single and keep loneliness at bay. Click. Okay. I got my first roll. Lovely. I got to ban someone on Twitch. Actually kind of exciting. I feel like that's a growth moment. So how to embrace being single and how to keep loneliness at bay. So at the moment, I am single, and I have been actually since the beginning of the pandemic. That the relationship I was in right before that ended, and I came back to the U.S. and was intending to travel around a bit and look for a home base here in the U.S. And then all those plans went sideways. So it's been a little bit. It's not the longest I've ever been single in my adult life, but it's been a little bit. Something that I have found works well for me is recognizing that even if you're single, and even if you're not dating, like actively, if you're not going out and you're not seeing people and there's not anything that you're thinking, oh, this could turn into something. Even if you're not actively dating, a lot of us tend to still keep like a carve out in our lives, in our lifestyles, in our psychologies, our energy levels. There's something that we carve out and keep separate and ready for somebody else. And I personally think, and this is from experience, that it can be healthy to not do that periodically. If you're single and you're not in something where that seems to be going somewhere, and you think it might continue for a bit, or you're okay with it going on for a bit, embracing it and saying, I'm dating myself right now, if you want to see it that way. But basically, just saying I'm taking that piece of mental real estate and I'm using it for me, and I'm going to invest it in me, and I'm going to be healthier, happier. I'm going to learn more things. I'm going to be growth oriented. I'm going to do stuff that I've been wanting to do rather than waiting on somebody else and hoping somebody else comes into your life and enables you that stuff. You're just going to do it. And the benefits of this, the two main benefits in my mind, is that one, you're not considering yourself to be incomplete because you don't have that other person in your life. And so you're able to see yourself as a totemic whole. You are a strong column standing tall. You are sturdy and capable, and you can hold up stuff on your own. You're fine. But it also puts you in a position that as you're growing and doing all of this stuff and investing in yourself, that then when you do meet somebody, if and when, because you don't have to meet somebody, but if and when you do decide that you want to put yourself out there again, or if you do accidentally meet somebody, you're going to be this like even better version of yourself because you've taken all of this time, energy, and resources that otherwise would have just been sitting there, segregated, waiting for somebody else to utilize them in your life. You're spending it on yourself and your own growth. And I consistently find that to be the case. When I've had these moments in my life where it's been, for whatever reason, a long dry spell in terms of dating, when I can refocus that attention and energy on my own stuff, one, I'm a million times happier. But two, then when I do connect with somebody again, I find I don't want to say I'm a completely different person, but maybe I'm a much more refined version of who I was. I can look back at who I was before and look at who I am in that moment and see the growth. And that's something worth aiming for. And that, for me, helps too, because then I think, well, I'm not dating. I'm learning archery, or I'm learning woodworking, or I'm going to be fitter than I've ever been in my entire life, or I'm going to improve my diet, or there's all these other things that you could be doing and ways that you could be measuring that time instead of just saying, well, I'm single now. So it's something to think about. I know it can be hard, and it can be especially hard if it's not something that you have a lot of experience with, or if it's something where it's a pandemic and everything sucks and there's a lot of uncertainty and stress, and you kind of just want somebody to send memes to. Like, you just want somebody. That's understandable and normal and totally okay. But it's also okay, I think, that within that and acknowledging the legitimacy of those feelings, that you can also plant some seeds and try to make some investments in yourself at the same time that you're feeling those very legitimate feelings. And that, for me personally at least, helps a whole lot and tends to lead to much better outcomes eventually. Congratulations. Roll. I am excited about that. I don't get a lot of trolls. I don't know if the audience just isn't big enough, or I've just done a good job at turning away everybody who doesn't dig something that I'm talking about. Oh, dating cities rather than people. Maggie, that's a really great way of putting that. I like that. Dating cities. The implications of that are really. So I'm looking for questions here. Oh, what's your take on psychedelics? Um, I think they're endlessly fascinating. Uh, so I haven't done any psychedelics. I haven't smoked pot. I'm incredibly boring in terms of substances. I barely take painkillers unless I really need it. And I'm not anti-drug. I just tend to, yeah, it's stubbornness actually. And sometimes I have to berate myself afterwards for not taking painkillers when I should. But my approach towards substances in general tends to be that of somebody who believes they should be able to accomplish these things without external stimuli. And that's not going to be true 100% of the time. And my understanding with psychedelics in particular is that's definitely not true. My sense is that probably someday, in the right circumstances, right people with the right substance, I'll probably experiment with it, with them. At the moment, though, just from a distance, I appreciate them a great deal. And I think there's a whole lot of potential utility in terms of like dealing with trauma and things like that. A lot of the research coming out in terms of using psychedelics for therapeutic purposes is very good. There's a lot to be concerned about, especially in unregulated circumstances. You don't really know what you're getting, or if you're around people who you don't trust or who might screw with your vibe, which apparently is actually a significant variable in determining what kind of high or trip you get. But I mean, for me, it's just lovely. If anybody's interested in learning about psychedelics, there's a great book by Michael Pollan on the subject called, what is it, How to Free Your Mind? It's called How to Open Your Mind? How to Change Your Mind. Almost got it. Michael Pollan's just a really great writer, but he also he has a lot more insight into this topic than I do. And his thoughts on it, and the fact that actually there is a substance I use on a regular basis, caffeine, that these substances actually have more in common than you might think. And we all, including non-human animals, use these substances for different purposes, socially and ritualistically, and there's a chance that some of them are tied to important moments in human development. It's really fascinating stuff. I'm probably more interested and intrigued by psychedelics than most people who have not taken psychedelics. That's actually like, this is going to make me sound crazy, but for mushrooms in particular, psilocybin, a lot of people who take it end up being very enthusiastic about mushrooms and fungus and what they have to teach us and growing more of them and stuff. And there's a chance, a very, very small chance, that that's the beginning of the wave of the takeover by the mushroom. And we take them and it makes us feel good, it allows us to see things, but then we start to integrate them into our society and think like they think and bring more of them and get more people to take them. So there's a chance that that's the case. And I'm holding out because if everybody else goes full mushroom, I'm going to be one person who has read about this stuff at least, who sees it and knows what's happening. And I won't necessarily stop you, but I will be aware that you're part of the mushroom army. I say that as if I'm joking. I'm totally not. Do you rely more on intuition or logic? I would like to say logic, but most of us, most of the time, rely a great deal on intuition. Even if we believe we're being logical or rational, in most cases, we're starting with an idea of how things are and then post hoc justifying those things. So I have no reason to believe that I'm any different from every other human being on the planet in that regard. While I would like to believe logic and I do what I can to create frameworks for myself in terms of thinking and behaving that I hope orient me more toward logical stuff more of the time. Because intuition, although valuable in some circumstances, is also informed by what we know and what we experience. Just in a literal sense, not in the kind of mystical sense. Not a mystical or spiritual person's. My definition of intuition is it's the heuristics that we have, the mental frameworks that we use to more quickly respond to our environment. And that can only be based on things that we know about or have experienced in the past. And unfortunately, our prejudices and biases are also intuitions. And that's why in a lot of cases, if you have a bias or a prejudice, by being exposed to more things, more people, more experiences, you can usually get past that because it changes over time your heuristics, and as a consequence, your intuitions about people and places, things and ideas. So these things can be valuable. They are valuable. They allowed our ancestors to survive in very dangerous circumstances, but they also unfortunately can push us in the wrong direction at times, and we don't know when they're doing that. So for me, trying to move toward more logic, appropriate, but also I'm just assuming that I'm not doing it nearly as often as I suspect I am. Past the hour that I'd planned. I'll do a couple more questions here. Let's see, we got a question here on Twitch. Good morning from Jakarta. Yeah, that's another place I want to go visit. Do you still own the RV home? I do not. I no longer own the RV. I bought a 1985 Holiday Rambler Imperial 33-footer a couple of years ago and fixed it up. Spent more money fixing it up than I spent on the rig itself. And then I full-timed in it for the better part of a year around North America while on a speaking tour. And it was a whole lot of fun. It was very educational. It was also just incredibly stressful, though. And there were a lot of downsides to it. And part of that is from driving such a massive vehicle. Just certain places you can't go. And I had a tow car behind it. It was even longer. And you can't pull backwards without disconnecting the tow car. So it's very easy to get stuck. You can only really stop at truck stops. It's very difficult just getting gas. A lot of these things probably would have improved if I would have driven it for more than a year, but it was stressful. And I'm very glad I did it for the experience, because it kind of scared me, and that's part of why I did it to begin with. And I didn't know anything about anything. I had never set foot in a motorhome before I bought this thing. So as an experience, it was a very good idea, and I'm glad I did it. But I did sell it when I had the opportunity to do so. There's a place in Arizona called Quartzsite, which has like 4 or 5 actual buildings, and everything else is trailers and RVs and vans. And part of it is that you can actually, pro tip, if you find yourself in a van or an RV, you can boondock out there, which just means that you're operating with your own internal electricity and water resource. You can do that as long as you want, for free, anywhere in Quartzsite. So a lot of places, if you park an RV or a van somewhere, they'll tow you eventually, or there's some places that you just can't go. In Quartzsite, which is just in the middle of the desert, you can stay there as long as you want, for free. So a lot of people end up there, and some parts of the year, there's 500,000 people there, and no buildings. There's like a general store. I think the Dollar General went out of business, so there's just a local general store. And there's like a big room where they do community events, and there's a post office, but even that is in a trailer. It's a weird place. It's a delightful place. There's camel statues because they apparently tried to train American military cavalry in Quartzsite for use during World War I want to say. So it's an interesting place. If you ever get the chance, go, especially if you are in one of these vehicles. But I sold it when I had the opportunity in Quartzsite. That seemed like the place that I'd probably get the best price, because people there would know something about RVs, so they would know that the one that I had was pretty good, despite its age. And then let's do here. I'll grab one from the list. Buddy, thanks for all the waves. Okay, here's a good one to end on. And again, I'll say before I end that I'm going to be doing on Twitch, I'm going to be doing a one-sentence news conversation each night, probably at around the same time I did this one, probably at 7, now that I know I can do it. Still have a decent internet connection. Beginning next week. And I think I'm going to do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. See if I like it, and just to try to learn rapidly and get better at what I'm trying to do here. So if you want to join me on Twitch for those, it's Virtual Colin. Essentially just search for me. Virtual Colin is where you'll find my account there. But the question here, who has the best hair? Josh, Ryan, or me? That's Josh Milburn or Ryan Nicodemus of the Minimalists. They both have excellent hair. And mine actually, I've got pandemic hair right now. It's you maybe can't see it because I think I'm hiding it decently well, but as soon as I allow my hair to grow at all, it shoots off in all directions. I get like wings going out this way, and I get like Dragon Ball Z going off this way, and I get a mullet going out this way. So I have this weird mullety winged Dragon Ball Z hair that just goes off in all directions. And I'm at that point now where, because of the Omicron wave, I'm hoping that we'll be better off end of the month, February, and the numbers will drop down, and I'll feel a bit better going out to get my hair cut. I'm already like a month and a half overgrown. So all of which is to say, I think they have excellent hair to begin with, and I think they better maintain their hair. So I would say either one of them. I mean, by pure mass of hair, I say Ryan wins, and his is luxurious. So if you get the chance, tell Ryan that I love his hair. Thank you, everyone, for joining me tonight on Twitch, on Instagram. It was a real pleasure. I appreciate your time. If anything comes to mind, any other questions that you want to ask, apologies to the people who asked on Instagram earlier, too. I will answer those the next time I have a stream, or if that's going to be a while, I'll just send you a response. Sorry about that. Had a good amount of questions live. But if any questions come to mind, feel free to write me a message on any of the social medias, or at colin@exilelifestyle.com. Feel free to drop me a line. I respond to all those emails and would love to hear. Wherever you're at in the world, I hope you have a lovely night, morning, afternoon, weekend potentially. Enjoy. Thanks very much for joining me. And ending. See you guys. Thanks for joining.